Hey everyone, so in this video I'm going to do a brief walkthrough of the actual web interface of ISE. One thing to keep in mind is there is a lot of information and a lot of menus, so we're really going to hit these as we need them, more so later in other videos, versus just walking through every single menu. I do want to help give a good overview though, so you do know where to find things, as well as point out a couple of good spots to look for troubleshooting. So to start, this is the main interface. So when you log in, you are brought to this page giving you what usually has quite a bit more data. When we haven't been using the ICE server yet, there's very little information populated here. One thing that is handy is the system summary information. So I'll seeing this green little check mark pretty much says the server is fine. You can also look through here and see there's like high memory utilization, for instance. I'm pretty sure that's fairly standard. Especially when you're not in a distributed ICE environment where different services are spread across multiple servers. However, anyway, this is a good hop-off spot. It's a good just place to get an overview of the network. However, when walking through the menus, we're honestly going to probably spend most of our time under the Operations tab from a day-to-day perspective. So to start, we have Radius and live logs and live sessions. So, live logs is my favorite. In a working environment, you'd actually see logs in here and you'd be able to walk through and click details and look at the actual log output, which we will do in the next video, I think, that we go through. Very handy. We can also go to live sessions here, and this will show actual sessions that have of devices that are online and are still having accounting messages sent back to the Radius server or to ICE itself. So it's a great page. There's also some other things in here like some troubleshooting and adaptive network control, but we'll cover that later. The policy menu up top here. To start, we have our authentication policies. This is where we configure what is allowed to connect and then what ID store it should hit. We also have the authorization page. And this is actually another spot you'll spend quite a bit of time. This is where we say, if you are this, then you get this. And so you can see here, like if it's wireless.1x and using EPIM as chap, then we'll do a compound permission statement. Anyway, there's quite a few things in here. There's also under policy elements, we have dictionaries, conditions, and results. We'll go to results because this is an area that you'll more than likely spend time, especially under authorization and authorization profiles. Under this section, we actually configure the end result, which could be like permit access. It could be redirect to a WebAuth page, like this page right here, or this profile right here, or black hole, where it redirects to a page that says like this device has been stolen. So anyway, from a policy perspective, these are kind of the different areas. We also have profiling policies and client provisioning, and profiling is actually the page where it takes any information it can glean on the device that's connecting, and then give it a marker saying this looks like it's for instance a narrow hive access point. We have this natively in dashboard. All devices get fingerprinted. This is just the ICE version because on standard Catalyst switches and even on Aeronet controllers, sometimes they don't provide a full fingerprint, and this gives a little bit more granular view of what the device could be, even down to sometimes the model. So client provisioning is an area for if we were doing BYOD policies where someone brought in their device, registered it in the web auth page or in the web page, and then once they go through that registration, they can be redirected to install a supplicant provisioning wizard, which you see here, this Windows supplicant provisioning wizard. There's an Android and an iOS one as well as a Mac one. And there is actually a Chromebook NSP that does certificate installation as well. But what this does is it can install an SSID on the device as well as provision a certificate from the ICE server itself. And last but not least, there's the administration tab here. There's also work centers, but this is kind of confusing. I rarely use these unless I'm looking for certain information, which we'll kind of go through later. But administration is a big deal. So under system, we have actually quite a few menus. We'll start with deployment. So as you can see, this node is in standalone mode. until we register other ISE servers for this. It will be in standalone mode, as it does have to run all of the services necessary to make the ISE environment run. So from here, we can see, for instance, my server, and if I click on my server, we're brought in to see, what the roles are that I'm currently using. So as you can see right now, since this server is the only one in the environment, I am the administration, the monitoring, and the policy services node. So the differences between them are: administration is the node that contains all of the configurations in a read-write format as the primary. The secondary contains them in a read-only until it's promoted to primary. It also contains licensing. So you don't license each node individually. You load your licensing on the administration node, and that is the only place. Now, the monitoring node, and actually real quick, the administration node also pushes down policy to the monitoring node and the policy service node. So the monitoring node collects logs and gives us the operations live log portion, is all served from that server. So in a very dense environment, you definitely want to have administration and monitoring separate, because it is a very high intensity role, as it can take thousands of logs depending on how chatty the Radius device is. And then there's policy services. This is the actual Radius server you will point your AP and switch to, or even firewall to perform Radius functions. It also is the central web auth service. So when when a client is redirected to a CWA page, it will be off of the policy service node. One thing to keep in mind as well is these are typically lower requirements from a from a resources perspective, and they usually I recommend having more than one policy service node in a deployment. Whether it's in a small deployment or large deployment, having a failover Radius server can be the difference between all devices being offline. If a server goes down, to having it fail over and maintain connectivity for devices that are connected to the network or are going to connect. Now, there's also this Pam Failover. This is the ability to enable automatic failover for the primary administration node. It works fairly well. I know one thing that's kind of difficult with the Pam failover is if not all the services fail, I do not believe it automatically fails over, or at least it didn't in the past. However, if you need an automated failover, this is the easiest way to do it. It is also easy to come into the deployment on the server that needs to become the primary and click Make Primary, and that's the manual way of doing so. You may also hear of people wondering how to enable profiling and more granular profiling. So one thing we can do is, like our MXs, for instance, we could point NetFlow to this device. So we could say, hey, let's point this as a NetFlow collector. We can also collect DHCP. So if we forward DHCP packets to the ISE server, it can also look at the DHCP information for profiling. We can also say that we want to use the DHCP span probe. So on, for instance, Gigabit Ethernet 0, I want to say, hey, this is where you're going to collect any span probes for DHCP. We can also do HTTP profiling. So what this does is that when a client connects to the web GUI, it will look at the HTTP info and take that, like the user agent, for instance, and try to make sure that matches up with that type of client, or rewrite that profile depending. There's also Radius, there's Nmap, there's DNS query lookups, so it can perform a DNS lookup as well. There's also Active Directory. This one's fairly new, but it can query Active Directory to see what device is mapped to what, so it can kind of see what type of device it is. And there's also SNMP query, where it can query the network device or the network access device, being your switch or AP. Not in a Meraki network, but in a standard Cisco network. SNMP query is fairly handy as well. Anyway, you can click Save here. And this allows it to actually have all of those listening services running. This may take a minute. All right. Now, the next line over is our licensing page. So this is also an area that should be understood fairly well. There's a couple different versions of licensing. There's Base, Plus, and Apex. Base gives you Radius authentication all the way up to where we could just do wired auth and policy, and Apex gives you wired and wireless. There's also device admin, and this is going to be TACACS, so we don't need this. However, in a Catalyst environment, or even Catalyst and Aeronet, having TACACS is very handy, and this can be enabled with this license here. So the next tab over in the system page is going to be certificates. These are this is a very good spot to understand as well. So for instance, we have a default self-signed certificate. What this does is the ISE server, when it is being enabled and provisioned at the beginning of the installation process, it will generate itself a self-signed certificate. You can come in and regenerate the certificate and make it longer. For instance, it's only a year to start. If you're only going to use the self-signed certificate, I would increase this out a couple years just in case you do end up using this in a persistent environment. It maintains connectivity. You don't have a cert, become invalid. When you are generating a certificate signing request and such, and you bind it to the CSR, you will see that certificate, which has been signed by whichever CA you require, will be in this list as well as a system certificate. There's also endpoint certificates. So when we're deploying certificates to end devices in a BYOD environment, these will show up here as well. Trusted certificates. So if you are doing, Meraki MDM and you're deploying certificates out to that MDM or from the MDM to your end devices, and you want to authenticate wireless with ISE as the radius server, you would take the MDM certificate and, the entire certificate chain and drop it into this trusted certificates list, and that will allow it to decrypt those certificates and actually authenticate the client based on that data. So trusted certificates is a good spot to understand. If you have like a Cisco phone, for instance, enable both of these, Cisco CA Manufacturing and Root CA. You can just click, one at a time, you can click Edit and enable these. And what that'll do is you can actually just enable the manufacturer installed cert to authenticate that phone, for instance. So that's a good thing to know as well. There's also the built-in certificate authority, and this is where we can see the certificates that it has as its own Root CA certificates. We can create templates here for different types of devices. So for instance, I could add a new template and set the SAN information and set what it's used for. They keep adding to this every time I come back to it. So there are new feature sets and functionality that are in here that I need to look into. There's also external CA. So if you were to point to another SCEP server, we can easily do so by clicking Add here and then giving it the right URL information. All right, so other than that, there's a number of other places that we can delve through. We will do this later in other videos. One last spot though is the administrator page. When you are adding a new user to authenticate and, or not authenticate, but to administer the ISE server, do it underneath Administration, Admin Access, Administrators, Admin Users, and click Add here. When you create a new admin user, that at least allows you to have multiple people in here and be able to see who's making what change. Other than that, I think the next video we're going to walk through how to configure network access devices in ISE.